Welcome to the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I interview business leaders who are committed to their own growth and the development of everyone on their team. If you enjoy my podcast, be sure to subscribe and rate it on your favorite podcast platform. Welcome to another episode of the Grow Strong Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Bell, and I'm so glad you've chosen to join me today. I love sharing with you people who are committed to their own growth and development, and also to those around them. And we have a wonderful guest who's going to do that today. And the focus of our company is also to help people connect more effectively with each other at work. And we have tools and books that make this possible, and you can check us out at growstrongleaders.com. I'd like to welcome today Mari Ryan. Mari, I'm so glad to have you on my podcast.
Thanks, Meredith. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, before we get started, I want to give a big shout out to Janice Litvin, who introduced us. And Janice was my guest on episode 133. And I want to encourage my listeners to check that one out, because what she and I talked about around banishing burnout really leads beautifully into the conversation that you and I are going to be having today around wellness. Before we get started, though, let me tell my listeners a little bit about you. Mari Ryan is a workplace well-being strategist, speaker, and author. She works with organizations to create workplaces where both the people and the business thrive. And Mari is the author of the award-winning book, which I have right here, The Thriving Hive: How People-Centric Workplaces Ignite Engagement and Fuel Results. And Mari is also the president of the National Speakers Association New England chapter. So, Mari, there are two things I want us to kick off with. First, to tell us a little bit about your journey to the work you're doing today and how you came to write this book about the Thriving Hive.
Well, thanks, Meredith. I'm delighted to share my journey. I have spent my entire career in business and done a variety of different types of positions and roles in a variety of different kinds of industries. But in the early 2000s, I was working as a consultant, and I was traveling 100% of the time. I was traveling from Boston, where I live, to Seattle and staying for 10 days and coming back. And 1 week a month, I was traveling from Boston to Dublin, Ireland, and coming back in the same week. So I had 3,000-mile weeks and I had 6,000-mile weeks. And I got home at the end of 20 months or a little bit more of this kind of work. And I said, this life sucks. This is not what I want to do with my life. And I decided to use some time. I was taking a break from work for a couple of months, and I decided to use that time to really explore, what am I meant to be doing with my life? And what is the work that I want to do for the rest of my career that's going to be really meaningful for me? So I hired a life coach to help me with that work. And it took me a couple of years, but I found in that journey workplace, what we called then wellness. And I thought, well, I know workplaces. I've spent my entire career in business and in work sites. I got that part down. How hard can it be to learn the wellness piece? So I set on the journey to become a workplace well-being consultant and went back to school to earn a master's in health promotion. Somehow I didn't think an MBA was enough. And I spent 2 years doing that. And then as I was finishing up, I got a call from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Department of Public Health. They had a project they needed some help with that happened to be exactly what I had just done in my capstone project for my master's program. And I thought, okay, then I guess this is meant to be. And they were my first client. And that was, like 18 years ago now. So
wow.
Off I went. Yes. And in terms of, the journey to writing my book is, as I've been working in this field for so many years, it became clear to me that I wanted to tell a story. I wrote this book in a parable form. And I really wanted to tell the story about how we can create workplaces where people and the business can thrive. And in parable form, it's a story. So I set it in two beehives, and one is called the Dive Hive, and one is the Alive Hive. So where would you rather work? And in 2019, I published the book in 2018. In 2019, it won a National Business Book Award.
Well, that's great. I've read it. It is a wonderful read. I highly recommend it because the story is engaging because it alternates between real people and these hives and what's happening in them. And I think readers can really appreciate the contrast that you create between the two, especially if they've worked in different kinds of workplaces where they've been, brought to life, or they have been stressed out due to the pressures that are similar to what the Dive Hive was structured as.
Yes, exactly. And I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people who have told me about their Dive Hive experiences and are seeking, places where they can come alive, where they feel like they are really cared for and that their well-being is looked after in the work.
Well-being is, kind of a hot topic right now. And as I think about the pressure so many companies have been under over the last few years, the organization itself, with the sudden changes that COVID brought, and then the pressures on the people too, it exacerbated some of the conditions that were already existing. And so I think this is a very timely conversation because we are coming out of the other side of it, and yet there are still so many residual aspects that are still with us. And so one of the things I think would be interesting is looking at what are some of the biggest obstacles that you have found that prevent organizations from creating what you like to call people-centric cultures?
Well, I really like that question because there are these perceptions that we can't do this, it's too hard. And I think one of the biggest obstacles really is what I would call kind of outdated thinking. So thinking that profit is the reason for being and for being in business. And we all know that employers can't achieve their goals without their people.
Mm-hmm.
And if profit is, if you put profit before people, you are really, in some cases, maybe misplacing what's important, because profit should be an outcome, not the goal. So I think that outdated thinking is a real, one of the real obstacles that I see. And I think the other piece is for really educating everyone in the workplace about the value and the benefits of well-being. That well-being is really encompassing, all encompassing. And there are so many things that actually influence well-being in the workplace that we don't think about as, the kinds of things that, that's just the way we do it here, kinds of things. So I think when people start to think more broadly about what well-being is and how many things influence well-being, then we can start to take action and know that we can really influence this in the workplace.
Let's take a step back. I would love for you to define for us your definition of well-being. What does it mean to you? So we've got this common language we're using during this conversation.
Yeah, great idea. Thank you, Meredith. And, it's interesting when I'm doing strategy work with clients, we actually do this. We build a model for their organization. I was just having this conversation last week with a client about what do we want well-being to mean in this organization? So when we think about wellness is the word that we've kind of used for decades. And wellness, we tend to think of as our physical health. So how much I weigh and what I eat, and do I get enough sleep, and do I refrain from using tobacco products, and how much I move. And so the physical aspects is what we think of as wellness. But when we think about well-being, we want to think more broadly. So we want to think about the elements of financial well-being as an example. Employers offer a ton of benefits, right? Historically, this has been the way that, employers take care of their people is through their overall compensation packages. And so when you look at that compensation package, that is part of financial well-being. So there's many elements and many benefits that fall under that, because we all know that, if our financial life is out of whack, everything is out of whack.
Right.
So it's an important element to acknowledge and to show the different types of support that the employer provides in that setting. The other pieces have to do with things like community and connections. So we all as human beings want to belong, not just fit in, but to belong in an environment where we can feel like we can be thriving. So this sense of belonging and connectedness is really an important element of this. And there's a lot of organizations that I hear struggling with how to make people feel connected to the organization, which goes to another element, which could be thinking about purpose. So this can be the individual's purpose. Like, what's my purpose? Why am I here? What gets me excited to get out of bed and show up at work every day? And that can also be translated into the organization's purpose. So how does the organization represent the good that it is doing in the world and how it is helping the world, not just making a profit? So that's how we tend to think about well-being as being a much broader subject.
I like that because it is all encompassing, and it ties in, there are many companies that now have the DEI or DEIB positions where belonging is an integral part of that. I'm curious if when you are starting to work with a client, do you get pulled into that overall arena in the belonging aspect of well-being? Or I guess I'm curious, and it may vary depending on the size of the organization, because buy-in needs to happen obviously at the top, but I was wondering who you typically work with to structure this definition. And I like the fact that you individualize it for each organization depending on what they currently focus on, their existing values and everything else. So you're tying it in to be an integrated part, not some separate program.
Exactly. It's got to be integrated. So integration is the key word, because there's all of these initiatives, as you've mentioned, that are going on. So it might be things that are going on with DEI and B, or it might be organizational development or leadership development. And well-being needs to be integrated with those. Doesn't have to own things, right? This isn't about ownership. This is about integration, so that everybody's thinking about how does this influence the well-being, either to support it, or if the elements aren't present, like inclusion and belonging, how does that diminish someone's well-being? So we want to be thinking about integration of those functions so that those teams are talking to each other and really making connections about how to be thinking from a well-being perspective.
I just got this flash as we're talking here. This idea of well-being, to me, the word being is so important. And so just imagining a company trying to, or making a commitment to integrate well-being, what does that say about how leaders are being with their people? And so talk a little bit about I know you help companies form policies, but of course, policies are there to help drive behavior. And so talk a little bit about what kind of policies do you help them put into place that then influence how they are being with each other?
Well, that's a great question, because when we think about policies, I think the ones that come to mind most right now, I think back to this, like clients I was working with in 2019 who were having these big drawn out discussions about, should we do work from home policies? And then 2020 comes along and like, you don't have a choice, folks. This is going to happen. And so, things like work from home are policies in the workplace, and how organizations literally overnight adapted because they were forced to. And, the forward-thinking organizations have been doing this for years. But that's a good example of a policy that takes into consideration employee well-being, because I have, cut out my commute potentially. You think about people who, were commuting hours every day, who are no longer having to do that, how they can then repurpose that time for family things or exercise or, things that will support their well-being. So that's a common one. But it's not just around the behavior that we want to create in a workplace. It's also around the kind of people we want to attract to our workplace. So things like family leave policies. So if your organization is really trying to attract younger employees who may be in childbearing ages, whether they be fathers or mothers, if you want those individuals in your workplace, then you need to have family-friendly policies, whether those are family leave, work day flexibility, whatever those kinds of things are. That's another example of the kind of policy, that you might want to do. And at a more tactical level, we hear how stressed people are in the workplace. They go from meeting to meeting to meeting and no time to take a break or go to the bathroom or get a drink of water. And we can't live like that. And we can, but it's not healthy, obviously. But having organizations acknowledge that and say, all right, Friday mornings or Friday, let's take the entire day Friday. We're having no internal meetings. Friday is a meeting-free day. It's time for you to do your work, to be able to have, quiet time and productive time where you can work on your work as opposed to just being in a meeting. And that's not such a common policy, right? Because organizations might say, well, we can't do that. Well, you can. Or you can set meeting times to be 50 minutes instead of 60 minutes so that people have time to take a break in between meetings. So it just depends on how creative the organization is going to be, and how willing they are to say, if we see people are stressed and they need time to be able to do the work, as an example, then let's set some policies that will support that.
Well, when we think about leaders being a particular way with their people, of course, it starts with taking care of themselves. And many of leaders feel that they don't have time to do that. They're just feeling overwhelmed. So what do you do to, it's like putting on your own oxygen mask first. What do you do to help them realize it's important to take care of themselves if they're going to be able to be fully present and be their best with the folks they work with?
Well, that's the answer, is you have to put your oxygen mask on first. If we don't take care of ourselves, we can't be there for anyone else. So we have to remember that the things we do to be able to take care of ourselves help us be present and be supportive of the people around us. It's not selfish to do self-care and to take care of ourselves. And how often have we seen, and no doubt in your conversation with Janice on this, how burnout comes about, is people just keep going and going and going and going until they can't go anymore. And then they just stop because they're exhausted. And, it has a lot of potential for really detrimental impact to our health. And it's just not worth it. It's just not worth doing that for a job when, we really can't do anything really productively and effectively if we aren't healthy.
So what are some things that you do to help some of these leaders who maybe don't even realize that they're not taking care of themselves? They may not be in denial. They may just be blind to it. How do you help them see what are some of the impacts of their behaviors, or like the dive hive? What's happening when they aren't taking care of themselves? What does that look like in the way they interact with others?
Yeah, it has a lot of different possible ways of manifesting. So some of the ways I think about how some of this comes to be is, people who just don't have enough energy, right? So we see this often ask a question. It's not an unusual question to use in a survey is, do you feel like you have enough energy to get through the workday? And often people say they don't. And that might be because they're not getting enough sleep, or because they're not taking breaks, or they're not eating well, or they're eating on the run. And, any of those things can be possible reasons that they are not taking care of themselves. But, what it comes down to is, I think most people know, they just say, well, it's okay. I can do this. I can do this. I can keep going. And the reality is that it may come off as one way that, from a leader's perspective, is that you then expect that of everyone else. And so it doesn't give people the opportunity to set boundaries and to stop and not work on weekends and not answer emails at 10 o'clock at night and those kinds of things. So it can be that the leader becomes sort of over demanding of, that's the behavior that employees see and managers see, then they're thinking, oh, that's what I'm supposed to be doing, because leaders need to lead by role modeling. And when they don't, then that sends the wrong message. But I think the other thing is that it can come across, I think people get just cranky, right? They get short with people, or, they get unpleasant to be around. Well, who wants to be around those kind of people, right? Nobody. So that's why I think it's really important to remember that as managers, if you see these signs in your people, in your employees, to be empathetic and support them and say, hey, what's going on, Meredith? It seems like you're a little stressed these days, or is there anything I can do to support you in this? And likewise, sometimes we have to call leaders out on this, because leaders sometimes have the perception that, oh, this doesn't apply to me, right? I'm a leader, I can do this. When in reality, leaders are struggling with this too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen that as well. As you were talking, I was thinking about one of the other things that happens to me is when I'm feeling stressed or whatever, feeling intolerant of the mistakes or shortcomings of other people. And what I've learned to do is realize I'm unhappy with myself when I actually am seeing these things in others that annoy me. And I think, why can't they do this? And then I just have learned to turn the tables and say, all right, what is it I'm doing or not doing that's bugging me? Because that's always the crux of it, is it's internal first that I'm then looking at in my outer world.
Perfect description, Meredith. Thank you. That's perfect.
Well, I'm curious, what are some of the specific things that you've seen with companies that you work with when you come in initially and you help them, diagnose or discover what is it they want to create that they don't currently have in the way of well-being and a people-centric culture? Give us an example, of course, without naming names, but what is it they were struggling with? What were some of the symptoms they were seeing that were problematic? And then what were some of the kinds of interventions you did, and what was the outcome after your work with them?
Sure. The interesting piece is that the motivation for wanting to do a well-being strategy, to have a well-being strategy in place, has changed over time. With some of my early clients, it was they wanted to control healthcare costs. Well, healthcare costs are a multidimensional type of thing and aren't so easily controlled. But there's been this belief that, well, if we do employee well-being, that our healthcare costs will go down. Well, that may or may not be true. And that was some of the things that originally some of our clients were asking for. But more recently, the topic really has to do with with employee engagement. So we want to make sure that our people are engaged. So employees that are healthy, that feel that they are cared for, that have a strong feeling of well-being in the workplace are going to be more productive, and they're going to be happier in the workplace. So it ends up that well-being can actually be a talent management strategy. Because we know how difficult it is today with the Great Resignation and the changes in the workplace to attract employees. And younger people in particular really prioritize well-being as being important. So employers have to be talking about well-being as part of their recruitment strategy and the culture that they create in the workplace. And then once they've got people there, they want to engage them and retain them. So how do you show you care for people? And what are the different things that you do? So when we're developing a strategy, we do a whole deep dive discovery process where we basically document the organization as it is today. So what have you got? What are your benefits? What are your policies? What's the culture like? We do both qualitative and quantitative data gathering, and we create the snapshot of where the organization is today. And we look at that and we say, are there elements here that are diminishing employee well-being? Or are there elements here that are supporting employee well-being? And we weigh those. And then through that process, we then start to develop the vision of what they want the workplace to be. And then there's that gap. So how do we go from where we are to where we want to be? And that's where you define the interventions, and they vary. There's some standard ones that organizations, do. If it's a smaller organization and they don't have, for example, an employee assistance program, you want to be able to have a program like that as a standard benefit in place to support your employees. Putting in place depends on, now that the physical workplace has changed, how do you change some of your benefits for things like telehealth or supporting mental well-being by having, full access to not just a limited network, but full access to resources for mental well-being. So there's any number of things that are going to, depend on the physical workplace that people are in. Changing the physical workplace actually can help people thrive. We may not think about that one as much anymore because, people are working in their homes more. But even if they are working in their homes, are we offering them, the kind of ergonomic support and, types of things that are going to help them be productive in their workday? So the interventions can vary. But we look very broadly across the organization to make sure that anything that potentially could be diminishing well-being is being addressed.
That's great. And so what are some of the outcomes or benefits that organizations have seen as a result of going through this process with you?
Well, to my first comment, that while we don't necessarily have a lot of evidence that says it can control healthcare costs, we had one organization we've worked with. We're actually now doing their third strategy in 10 years. And in the first 5 years, they were able to keep their healthcare costs flat. They were spending, it's a big organization, they were spending about $50 million a year on their healthcare costs. And they were actually able to keep those costs flat. But their focus then became more about employee engagement. And so, we use metrics such as retention and a net promoter score of willingness to refer someone to work in the organization as those kinds of metrics. And in this one case, this happened to be a hospital system, they became a best place to work, which was one of their goals. So there's a lot of different ways to measure, what that is. And a lot of employee engagement surveys are some of the tools that we might also use to be able to measure some of that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I am imagining my listeners are taking away is thinking of a way to approach this whole topic of well-being, how to define it, and then how to go about looking at where are we now, what do we like, what's not working, looking at the gap between that and where they want to be, as you said, and looking at what the potential benefits could be of taking that action. On a personal level, thinking of individual leaders that you may have worked with or that have benefited from the process you've helped a company put in place, What, besides them staying and being engaged, what are some of the other benefits that you've seen or your clients have shared with you that individuals report?
Well, when we think about the individual employees, one of the things that I hear so often, and it's always fascinating to me when I'm doing like employee focus group meetings and people are, I have a series of questions that I ask people to, sort of get them talking about, what it's like to be in this workplace and what would it feel like to be supported. And so many times people say they just want to feel cared for. And I always find that so interesting that people just, it sounds like a very basic need, right? They just want to feel cared for. And that's the thing that I think when people, when leaders work both at the individual level and at the organizational level to make people feel cared for, that's when they are really creating a workplace where everyone will thrive. And all the benefits, of the being able to attract, engage, retain, having productive, happy, healthy people, all of those things will come. But at the foundation of it, it's really about making people feel cared for.
I love that. I agree with you 100%. We all want to know we matter.
Right.
And it's so interesting how in the context of what we've been talking about, this idea of an individual leader or a coworker recognizing someone else's value and commenting on it. It's the kind of thing that to me is tied really more to an organization's values and mission, more so than a policy. You really can't mandate that kind of thing, but it's more the spirit that thrives, going back to your word, that the thriving hive. And I loved, the distinction you made in your book with those two. And I think as a way to kind of summarize this discussion, what is it that the people in a thriving hive, thriving workplace, what does it look like if somebody were kind of hovering from above and taking a look at what's going on here? What would they see? Just like with your hive that you described in your book.
Yeah. Well, they would see both the role that leaders play. So it starts with the leaders, and it's the way that the leaders show they care for people. So I describe in one of the Alive Hive chapters how the CEO, the queen bee, if you will, works as part of the onboarding process to welcome new employees into the organization. And you say, is that really achievable? Well, yeah, it is. There can be a number of different ways that you can do that, but making people really feel cared for from the very first day. And that can be interaction with, doesn't have to be just one senior leader. It could be, any number of senior leaders who are the proxy for the entire senior leadership team. And it's about the way the leaders create that culture that uses language. So part of its communications, it's about how they create that culture that says people are first. We care about our people and we put people first. And in doing that, what they're really doing is sending a message that says, we care about our people. These are the characteristics of that and the behavior that supports that. And oh, by the way, this is the behavior that doesn't support that and that will not be tolerated. So being very clear about what we do not do is part of that. And I think, those are the kinds of things. It's got to come from the leadership, and it's got to tie it back to, and this is why I say the senior leaders really play a key role in this, is what's the purpose of the organization? In a people-centric workplace, it's about creating an environment where people feel connected to the purpose of the organization. And again, it's not profit. Profit's an outcome. Purpose is what is the good that we're doing in this world? How are we helping people, mankind, in the work that we do? And when that can be clear and tying that to the values that will help us achieve that goal, when you link the purpose and the values, then you're creating the culture that's a place where people want to work. And then, tactically, it's got to be reinforced through communications. Communications is such an important part of this. It's, the words, it's what we see in the behavior, because, culture is the values, the norms, the accepted behavior, and the assumptions by which we live in the environment. But it's the communication that helps reinforce all that.
Mm-hmm. That's so true. How people treat each other, basically.
Exactly. Right.
Mari,
And that goes to the behavior that we won't tolerate too.
Yes. And I think that's very important.
Yeah.
That you are making the distinction about both what we want to see and what we don't tolerate, and doing that before the person is ever hired, so that you make sure you're selecting the right kind of people to be on the team who will fit in with that environment you want to create.
Exactly.
So important. Mari, thank you so much for being with me today. I've so enjoyed this conversation and your insights and your wisdom around what it takes to create a place. Your whole presence speaks of well-being. And so you're a wonderful model for what it is that you're teaching. And I know many of my listeners will be interested in learning more about you and getting a copy of your wonderful book, The Thriving Hive. So please tell them how they can connect with you, learn more about your services, and get a copy of your book.
Best way to connect is by visiting our website at Advancing Wellness, and that's advwellness.com. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I do a lot of, posting on LinkedIn, and my book is available in paperback, ebook, and available on Audible. So any one of those sources.
Great. And we'll include links to your book and your website in the show notes page, so people will be able to check that out. Mari, thank you so much. I'm so glad you were able to join me today, and it's been just such a pleasure talking with you.
Always great to spend time with you, Meredith. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into my podcast. Now head over to growstrongleaders.com and check out our 2 books, Connect with Your Team and Peer Coaching Made Simple. While you're there, download the free facilitator guide to find out how to implement our unique peer coaching system. Until next time, I'm Meredith Bell.